Details that have often been forgotten, from vanishing planes to famous pilots. So, here are 5 things you may have never known about the Avenger torpedo bomber. To begin our list for today, we will look at an unfortunate coincidence as the TBF was being unveiled to the world in 1941. The Avenger would take its first flight in August of that year, and just a few short months later was ordered into production to replace the outdated TBD Devastator. As this production was beginning, Grumman announced a new plant in New York that would be the site that this new torpedo bomber was to be built. Appropriately, there was a ceremony planned, and the aircraft was unveiled to the public. In a coincidence that would foreshadow a trying future, the ceremony would take place on the morning of December 7th of 1941, the same day that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor.
I think it was definitely ironic when they rolled out this brand new airplane on the day Pearl Harbor was attacked, particularly since it was intended to be a naval aircraft and the Pacific War was going to be a naval war. I think the impact that it had meant that the TBM was going to be built in much larger numbers than maybe they had previously expected, because once we were at war, aircraft production went through the roof. And interestingly enough, we talk about the TBF, but there's also the TBM, which was the Grumman Avenger built by General Motors. And it became, in order to build the numbers of airplanes that were required, more than one manufacturer had to build them in places. But it turned out to be an excellent design and an excellent replacement for the Devs.
Towards the end of this ceremony, news reached New York of the surprise attack. Nearly immediately, the event was brought to a close and the plant was closed to the public. Security was ordered to seal off the facility as possible sabotage was feared. Shortly after, though, production would go on as planned, and by the end of the war, more than 9,000 Avengers would be built by Grumman and General Motors. And ironically for the Japanese, the aircraft that was displayed for the first time as they attacked Pearl Harbor would go on to play a key role in defeating them throughout the Pacific. In this second item on our list today, we will see that although the Avenger did have a great deal of success by the end of the war, this was not necessarily how things started off, as the first combat for the TBF was a terrible debut. This would take place in one of the most famous battles of the entire war, the Battle of Midway. In June of 1942, the Avenger had not yet been assigned to the American aircraft carriers, and the only squadron operating at this point in time was actually a detachment of Navy pilots flying off of Midway Island itself. On the morning of June 4th of 1942, they would be the very first aircraft sent to take on the Japanese fleet after she was spotted by a PBY scout plane. This unit in particular was selected as they were closer to the fleet and would be able to strike first before the Japanese began to bomb the island. Around 7 a.m., 6 TBF Avengers took off for their very first combat mission, along with 4 Air Force B-26s outfitted to carry torpedoes. They would be taking on the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy with no experience and no fighter escort. After flying for some time, they finally located the Japanese fleet and began their attack runs. This would be a colossal failure. At this point in the war, torpedo attack strategy from the air was far from perfected, and so the aircraft in this assault would be slaughtered. Of the 6 Avengers that took off from Midway, 5 of the aircraft were shot down by flak and Japanese Zeros. Only one of these Avengers would make it back to the island, and upon landing, her gunner had been killed in action and the bombardier was seriously injured. Ground crews counted more than 200 holes throughout the plane, as can be seen in this photo of the lucky surviving aircraft. Fortunately for the Avenger, the TBD Devastator saw similar losses in the Battle of Midway, making it clear that this was not the fault of the plane, but the tactics. Following these heavy casualties, the American torpedo strategy would be changed, and the results would see consistent improvement for the duration of the war. But as these changes were made, there was one other serious problem that needed to be addressed, and this is point number 3 in our video for today. the faulty American torpedoes that caused much grief among the U.S. naval aviators. And while this fact isn't exactly an issue with the Avenger itself, it was a problem that plagued this aircraft, and we will look at the repercussions of how exactly this affected the Avenger and her pilots. Let me introduce you to the Mark 13 torpedo. This was the primary aerial torpedo that was used by the United States in World War II. The thinking behind it was simple. U.S. Navy planes come in at a low level, flying at about 280 kilometers per hour and no more than 200 feet off the surface of the water. They would then drop their torpedoes at about a distance of 1 kilometer from the target. However, this proved to be a losing strategy for multiple reasons. First off, this left the aircraft flying very slow as they came in to drop their ordnance. 280 kilometers per hour would have most aircraft as sitting ducks for anti-aircraft fire, and the initial combat trials of the torpedo bomber made this crystal clear. Furthermore, in order for the aircraft to get down low enough to drop their torpedoes at the recommended altitude of 200 feet, this meant that their attack runs would have to be quite long, and that the planes would be much closer to the anti-aircraft guns that were shooting at them. When these parameters were met by naval aviators, it often meant that they were at a high risk of being shot down. When these parameters were not met, it unfortunately meant that the torpedoes would likely not work properly. Making the situation even worse, the Mark 13 torpedo quickly showed that even in ideal circumstances, it was far from reliable. According to historian Roland Buford in his book on the U.S. Navy ordnance in World War II, a study was implemented in 1943 to test the Mark 13 torpedo after reports of multiple failures. Here are the reported results. In mid-1943, an analysis of 105 torpedoes dropped at speeds in excess of 280 kilometers per hour showed clearly why aviators distrusted the Mark 13. 36% ran cold, 20% sank, 20% had poor deflection performance, 18% gave unsatisfactory depth performance, 2% ran on the surface, and only 31% gave a satisfactory run. This total, in excess of 100%, proved that many torpedoes were subject to more than one of the defects, just as the bulk of the problems were still due to the effects of poor air stabilization on water behavior. Better performance at reduced aircraft speed was small comfort since aviators could not be held down by paper restrictions that imposed serious and dangerous handicaps in combat. And even when they accepted the limitations, the water entry behavior of the torpedo produced frequent hooking and broaching. Clearly, the Mark 13 had a problem, and Navy pilots from across the Pacific were suffering because of it. In the Battle of Midway, for example, 41 torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese fleet. 35 of these planes were shot down, and almost all of the air crews gave their lives in service of their country. And what were the results of this attack? On paper, essentially nothing. Of all the torpedoes dropped by TBD Devastators from the carriers and the TBF Avengers from Midway, very few actually struck the targets, and the ones that did failed to explode. In fact, oddly enough, the only successful American torpedo attack in the Battle of Midway would come from a scout plane, a PBY flying boat that scored a hit against a Japanese oil tanker early on June 4th. Following the results from 1942 and 1943, the United States immediately began work to improve the Mark 13 torpedo. And like most American military projects of this time, they were successful in this endeavor. By the fall of 19